we want to talk about the definition of skill to craft. For many, many years in the nuclear industry, the way skill to craft has been treated is many of the power plants in the country actually develop like a skill to craft procedure. And what they would do is they would have this huge document that lists every single task that was considered to be skill to craft. If you found that task in that procedure, then as a procedure writer or a job planner, you didn't have to pretty much provide the how. You could just tell them to go do that thing. And it was assumed that they would know how to go do that because it was their skill of their craft, right? So what happened is that there's been a lot of problems in the nuclear industry with that, because if you go from power plant to power plant across the country, inspectors would look at these skill to craft documents and they would find a lot of inconsistencies from one plant to the next. Although they all have pretty much the same training requirements and the same nuclear regulatory issues, you know, so there was always this quandary about like, why is it different? And sometimes it would be different between the same power plants that were owned by the same utility. Some utilities own multiple plants, but yet they could have a different thing from one plant to the next. So a few years ago, it was basically tasked to EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, and there was funding for it to actually come up with a definition for skill to craft instead of this big book, all right? And so as our company, we were consultants that helped develop this definition. And so what I did was I got multiple colors there, so hopefully it doesn't like cause your head to hurt. But I wanted to kind of break this sentence out because it's a pretty long run-on sentence, right? But when you look at this sentence, there's some major parts of the definition as it defines skill to craft. So to read through this, to kind of break it apart, first off, when you're thinking of skill to craft, these are skills that the person possesses, right? Which goes without saying. If you're an electrician or instrument control technician, mechanic, operator, something along this line, and so in your title, you're called a senior operator or something like that, they assume that there's certain skills that you possess that you bring to the table just by the fact that you say, hey, look, I'm a qualified electrician. Now, if you look a little bit further from these skills that you possess, is that they consider you to be a qualified craft person. Now, what is qualified? Now, some places look at qualified / certified. Some people get hired meeting certain minimum job qualifications, but yet then they have to go through a training program and then they become certified in what they do. So if you go to a refinery, you know, you may end up having this position. They hired you because you had these minimum qualifications, and then you're certified. So whether you use the word qualified or certified, it's assuming that you have whatever your title is, that you have these skills and you're qualified to use them, right? Now, in doing that and having these skills and being qualified to use these skills independently of anybody else working with you, right? You don't have to have a supervisor looking over your shoulder, directing you what to do. It's assumed that you can perform these tasks that have been asked of you consistently, error-free, right? That's a big deal, right? So if you think about all the tasks that different craft people or qualified people could do on any given day, these are tasks that as a writer, you have to assume is that this is something that they have to be able to do consistently, error-free, right? And then they also put another disclaimer on it. Not only do you have to do it consistently error-free, but it has to be independent of any human performance risk that you could be subjected to, right? That could be noise, or time pressures, things of that nature, right? Things that would be, you know, maybe at your plant, you don't have valve labeling and things are written with magic marker on the side of a component or something like that. All those things tend to be risks to human performance. And so when you look at those things, we're saying, hey, look, you're skilled, you're qualified to do what you have to do. You got to be able to do it consistently, error-free. And on top of that, you can't have some type of human performance risk hanging over your head that's just waiting to say, get you, you know? And then on top of that, the last thing in the definition says is that you can't rely on written instructions or procedures to save you. So these are tasks that are specifically done independent of having any written documentation to support you. You got to be able to do it even with the human performance risk. You got to be able to do it consistently error-free, and you got to be qualified with it. So this definition is really tight in a lot of ways. It reads kind of a little vague and interpretive, you know, but overall, this definition is pretty rock solid in a way. If you don't fit this definition, what that's saying to you is when you go write a step in a procedure, you need to provide the detail to make up for the discrepancy or the gap there is in the risk that you have in this definition, right? Now, if you meet this definition and you feel comfortable with it, then the only thing you got to do is have a step that tells them what to do. It's assumed that they should be able to do it consistently error-free, independent of human performance risk, and be successful pretty much 100% of the time, right, to be able to do that. If not, then you got to provide more how. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to set the stage with you, and we'll come back to this definition again a little bit later. But overall, this is where the industry standard went. And again, this came from the Electric Power Research Institute, which they took great credit in, and is endorsed by a number of different industries. And so this is the definition that we use to try to help or where that line in the sand is between having detail or just telling them, hey, go do this, right? Now that you have the definition of skill to craft, right, you have to ask yourself, how does this fit in determining the correct level of detail when you're developing action steps in a procedure? I wanted to make, because we had different industries all in this one little webinar, right? I wanted to first make sure that we're all on the same page as it relates to what we call an action step, right? So when you think about the main steps that you would have that are directing things to occur in a procedure, right? Anytime a worker is asked to perform a task, that task is composed of steps called action steps, right? Now, the core of an action step always has like two main parts to it. It has the action verb, ensure, verify, open, close, perform, contact, all those types of action verbs. And then there's always an object, the object of where the action verb is being focused on, right? I might want to open a valve, but I want to open up this specific cooling water valve. And so it'll say open and give you a valve number and a name. That valve number and a name, or just a name in many places, there is no valve numbers, that is the object. So you have the action verb and the object, okay? That's the two main parts of an action step, right? Taking it a step further, right? Action steps need to really clearly and concisely communicate instructions for performance of that specific action. And what happens is, as a writer, this is a big deal right here. Every single action step, as a writer, you have to answer these three questions. Who's performing this step? What are we doing? Or how is it performed, right? Who's doing it? What are you doing it? What are you doing? Or how are you doing it, right? That's the three pieces. So for every action step, even though you have an action verb and an object, when you look at the content of those things, that action verb and object, right? You've got to be able to answer who's performing this task, what are we doing, or how are we getting it done? And so now the who, in many cases, can be implied because maybe that same person is performing all the steps. So we don't need to wear them out with ops, right? It's implied, and it's okay. You can do that, right? But then that still means, as writers, me and you, we have to decide, do I tell someone what to do, or do I tell someone how to do it, right? Now, to figure out how to determine if you have sufficient how, that it exists at the step level, they came up with 6 considerations. And many of you have been through my classes, you have seen this, right? And the PPA certification. And what they did was they came up with 6 things to consider. And what I wanted to try to show you is where skill of the craft fits into these 6 considerations, right? Because normally when I teach the PPA class, we have so much stuff to cover. I cover these 6 things. I discuss item 2 that you see on the screen right now, but I don't get into a lot of detail with this, right? So anyway, as you go through this, the first thing that we consider when you're looking at level of detail is we look at it and say, look, you need to make sure that there's enough detail that's there, it's necessary, so that you have someone who's inexperienced, although qualified, and does not have a supervisor to ask questions to. That's one consideration of 6, right? So here you are, you're trying to decide as a writer, do I tell someone what to do or do I tell someone how to do it? And you're trying to figure out, how do I do this? I've never done this job, so how do I figure this out myself, right? So maybe you need to go talk to a subject matter expert, or you talk to the craft themselves, or you look at a vendor manual and you read up on this thing and you're trying to figure out how to do this, right? And so you do that, right? But that's one item. The second item, and I put a box around this because this is the focus of this little Lunch with Steve thing, right? If you look at the qualification of the user, it's one of the 6 criteria they tell you that helps you with the level of detail. But notice what it says. It says step-by-step instructions are not needed for activities determined to be skill of the craft. For the discipline, which is the person or the qualified person that's performing that procedure. So what they're saying is, if you have something that meets that definition that we talked about previously in skill of the craft, you don't have to get into all the how to do this thing. It's okay just to say what to do, right? Overhaul pump, that would be stretching it, but that's the example. I don't provide all the steps on how to do it because somehow we looked at it and it's a little teeny whiny, little tiny pump. And, it's nothing to take this thing apart, and you ought to know how to do it, right? Because you're a qualified person and you're going to do that, right? So see where skill of craft fits into this, right? 3, they look at complexity of the task and say, all right, well, if the task is pretty complex, you're probably going to need to add more detail to it because sometimes it's a large volume of steps. Sometimes complexity is really just looking at the technology that's being used. Sometimes it's newer technology, which can be complex in the very beginning until you learn how to do it. Or it could be just the volume or maybe vague interpretive guidance. Maybe that causes it to be complex, right? Then you get into frequency and say, okay, well, how often do we do this? Do they do it monthly, weekly, daily, annually, every 2 years, every 5 years? And you look at it from that aspect, that can impact the level of detail because the more you do it, the more confident you are in what you do. The less you do it, the more that you may need written instructions to help you refresh your memory, keep you on task, to be able to do that. Then we talked about consistency, and we say, okay, when you're sitting there, you're trying to figure out, all right, does everybody need to do it exactly the same way? Or there's some unique ways that you could do this, and then so you got to figure out if do I got to tell them how, and we're going to do it one way, or do I tell them what? And then the last thing, but one of the greatest things in there is, what if we screw it up? What happens if you do get the consequences of error? It could be life-threatening. It could be equipment damage. It can cause millions and millions of dollars. All kinds of things, right? And so in doing this, we really need to try to understand in here that when you look at skill of the craft is one of 6 considerations, right? I don't know how much I really impressed upon that in my classes that I teach, right? It's just one, right? But in of itself, skill of craft basically has its own definition here that is very, very important, right? And so it's very, very narrow on what you can do if you follow the industry guidance, right, to be able to do that. I'm going to pause there for a second. So what we've talked about to this point is we've talked about the definition of skill of the craft. And then what I tried to do is frame it so you could see where skill of the craft kind of factors in with the 6 considerations that you need to take when you're trying to figure out, do I tell someone what to do or how? Back. So to truly understand the significance of skill of the craft when determining the level of detail, we must first fully understand why are procedures or work instructions, why are they important in the first place? You know what I mean? I mean, sometimes, I mean, if you look at some of the companies that we work with, you think that procedures are treated kind of like a necessary evil. You know, it's like I mean, I've found procedures where they're, I mean, what do? We do a lot of procedure upgrade projects. Right? Why am I doing that? Obviously, they haven't been kept up to date. There's not a lot of interest in doing it until something really goes bad. And then all of a sudden now either with some regulatory influence, you know, or maybe some senior management influence, you know, all of a sudden now there's emphasis placed on we got to fix these procedures, you know. And, you know, you can spend millions of dollars and sometimes depending on the extent of the condition. And so why do this in the first place? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a really quick video on this and look at this job. It was done in a remote area out down in Mississippi, right? But notice in this job, these guys pretty much killed themselves except for one person in there. And when they did this, notice how they were using skill of the craft. Although there was regulatory guidance that says you have to do these certain things, and they found the tools that they were needed to use that if they had used them probably would have prevented this thing in the pickup truck at the scene that weren't used, right? So look at this little video real quick.
June 5th, 2006, 3 maintenance workers were killed and a 4th was seriously injured in a violent explosion during a welding operation at a rural oil production field in Raleigh, Mississippi. The field was operated by Partridge Raleigh, a company that specializes in recovering oil from older, dormant wells. All the victims worked for Stringer's Oilfield Services, an independent contractor hired by Partridge Raleigh to install tanks and piping at the site. The CSB investigated and issued a case study calling for safer work practices in the oil and gas production sector, which has experienced a number of serious accidents.
Our case study noted that the fatality rate within the oil and gas extraction sector was more than 8 times higher than the average of all industries in the United States.
Well, we've been very concerned about safety in the oil fields for many years. In fact, this is the 4th case in which there have been multiple fatalities that the CSB has investigated.
CSB lead investigator Johnny Banks says there are key lessons from the Partridge Raleigh investigation that apply to many industries, particularly concerning what is called hot work, such as welding, cutting, and grinding that can cause ignition.
Workers should use extreme caution when performing hot work on any tank or container that holds or has held flammable materials. Their lives may depend on it.
The following animation shows how unsafe work practices and a lack of training led to a tragic loss of life at the Partridge Raleigh oil field. The oil field had 4 tanks. 1 was for wastewater, 2 were storage tanks that held oil prior to sale, and a 4th larger tank, a so-called production tank, received oil from the well. A Stringer's Oilfield Services crew arrived and began work to connect a pipe between the large production tank and the nearest storage tank. To prepare for welding, contract workers removed the hatch from the large production tank to clean and air it out. They then checked for remaining flammable hydrocarbons in the tank by using an unsafe and unreliable technique, inserting a lit oxyacetylene torch to check for a flash from ignition. The big tank was in fact empty, but crude oil remained inside one of the storage tanks, warming under the morning sun. Unseen by the workers, flammable vapor from the crude oil was flowing from that tank into the other storage tank through an overflow line, and then out into the atmosphere through an uncapped 3-inch pipe. This open pipe end was just 4 feet away from where they planned to weld. In order to provide a platform for the welder, a ladder was placed horizontally between the 2 tanks. To stabilize the ladder, 2 workers stood on top of one end. A foreman observed the work from atop the production tank. The welder, who was perched on the ladder but wore a safety harness secured to the tank, began by making 2 small welds to a pipe fitting. Sparks showered from the welding process, igniting the flammable vapor that was escaping from the open pipe end. Flames flashed back through the open pipe into the storage tank, causing an explosion which blew off the tank lid and the ladder that 3 of the workers were standing on. Flames shot through the overflow pipe into the next tank, causing an even more violent explosion from the flammable hydrocarbons inside and blowing its lid off as well. The first tank lid flew a distance of 50 feet. The other traveled 750 feet through the air.
2 workers that were standing atop tank number 3 and 1 that was standing atop tank number 4 were blown off by the force of the explosion. They suffered fatal injuries as a result.
Only the welder, who had been wearing a safety harness, survived, but he suffered a broken hip and ankle. The CSB investigation identified several unsafe work practices that contributed to the likelihood or severity of this accident. Prior to welding, workers only tested for the presence of hydrocarbons by inserting a lit acetylene torch into the production tank.
Not only is this dangerous, but it's not a good way to check for flammable vapors.
The workers did not use a flammable gas detector to test for vapor, which could have warned them that dangerous vapor was flowing out of the open pipe near where they planned to perform welding. Another unsafe practice was not capping the open pipe, especially important since all the tanks were interconnected, and one contained a significant amount of crude oil.
This case is a reminder that we need to look at hazards in the area around where we're working, that equipment that may be nearby that isn't directly involved in the job that you're doing, such as welding, can have deadly consequences if you don't address the hazards.
The CSB report also noted that the use of a makeshift work platform, the ladder braced by workers standing on top of the storage tank, unnecessarily put these 2 men in harm's way. They died when they fell from the exploding tank. The American Petroleum Institute, the National Fire Protection Association, and other organizations provide guidelines for safely performing hot work. Safe practices include issuing written hot work permits, ensuring work is performed only by trained personnel who understand the hazards, isolating areas where hot work will be performed from piping or tanks that contain flammable or combustible liquids by installing caps, blinds, or other physical devices, and using a gas detector to test for a flammable atmosphere before and during work.
Oilfield work can be extremely hazardous, and that's why training and procedures to do jobs such as hot work and welding are absolutely essential to avoid tragedies like the one in Mississippi.
Steve, can I ask a question?
Please do.
So that last video, just from years of working in nuclear power too, do they not do pre-job briefs? Do they not discuss, the hazards? I mean, I guess, Dave gets upset if we light anything in the garage near the lawnmower. So I guess I'm just kind of, I don't understand, the thought of going up there to do that without, knowing it's flammable.
Yeah. So OSHA requires the pre-job briefs, the basically a job safety analysis, JSAs, some people call them JHAs, job hazard analysis, before performing work. And as you can see, even in this example, they were very complacent. They cut corners, and then you could actually see the leadership. The supervisor was actually on that tank, and he died also. So he pretty much condoned the workarounds or the poor work practices. As you can see there, they were doing everything from what I would have called skill of the craft. You basically, they had, I'm sure, installed many of those tank assemblies at different well heads, Mississippi and other areas, and they've gotten to the point where their complacency led to their demise.
Steve, George here.
Go ahead, George.
Coming from across several industries into nuclear, you'll find that I found that nuclear is very very stage. So a lot of what you do in nuclear for capital pre-job free is not done in that industry. And as jobs are subcontracted out, you to smaller companies, etc. You find that, um, for example, the 15 minutes to do a pre-job brief may cost a company money, and so they don't. In the other industries, I find they don't do a pre-job brief as much as nuclear.
Yeah, they're George, I think you're right, because again, you're up from Canada there, but you have very similar rules as we do, right? So the idea here is that, where this whole thing is trying to point to is the need to have good, well-written procedures, right? Because in the prerequisite area of the procedure, you can have the steps there to obtain all that, the explosive meter, to perform these checks and whatever else, and you could have that. As they showed in that video, there was a regulatory guidance there that really, they called them guidelines, but those guidelines are really requirements, for doing stuff. And so, as you can see, they weren't translated well into the way they perform work. That makes sense, Brian? Anybody have anything else they'd like to add with that? What I wanted to try to show you was a good example. Some of you may have seen that video before. I don't show it too often in my classes anymore because it's a little old, but because there's other ones that are a lot better even today that are better examples, right? But if you look at that, it's really disturbing, right? I mean, it's again, as a procedure writer, there's times when you have to decide, well, we don't want to add this to the procedure because it's bloat. EPRI also talks about bloat. And what happens is if you have administrative requirements that are found in other procedures, you don't necessarily want to replicate those things. So you start layering things up so that you have it in your technical procedure. You can find it in an admin procedure. If they change the admin procedure, now the technical's not up to date. And so this little seminar is trying to find the balance in this stuff, on what we're trying to do. It's not easy, and it does come with some experience as you get into it, right? But if you don't even know to consider these things, then you're at a disadvantage, right? And that's what we were trying to help you with, through this little thing. Any questions so far with that? No?
Yeah, Steve. This is Lauren again.
Hey, Lauren.
Yeah, you actually touched on the question that I was considering. It's take, for instance, the refurbish the pump that you were talking about.
Yeah.
If it's like 2 or 3 steps, that's something that you can easily put into your procedure. But something that there's already another procedure or vendor manual or something like that has all the steps laid out, and you don't want to put all those into this procedure too, because then you end up having 2 procedures that you have to change,
right,
or more. So you pretty much just have to balance it to where if there's a lot of steps, then just refer to the other governing document.
Well, there's a couple things to think about that, Lauren, right? Because sometimes, remember that ultimately what you're trying to do is write this human factor document, right? So you got an industry guidance there. You're trying to make sure that you're eliminating the human performance errors. And unfortunately, sometimes when you branch to those vendor manuals, those vendor manuals look like they were written in Chinese and then converted to English. So and so you're branching to something of lesser quality. So I think that also has to be a consideration, because you may look at that and say, all right, well, I did my job. I created a human factor procedure and I branched to this thing, but you're branching to a piece of garbage. You know what I mean? Right. So you may have to take those steps out of that vendor manual and put this stuff in the document. I've had some plants I've worked at that says, no, we don't do that. We're afraid that vendor manual will change. And then next thing we'll have this issue. Then I looked at the vendor manual, it hasn't been updated since like 1953. I said, I kind of think you're safe, on doing this.
Let me ask another way then. Say you have a maintenance procedure that tells you step by step how to refurbish that pump. And I'm building an operations shutdown procedure that says, shut down all these systems. And then, but we want to include a step that says have maintenance refurbish this pump. can you just say have maintenance refurbish the pump in accordance with whatever the maintenance document is?
Yeah,
That's reasonable, right?
yeah, that's reasonable.
Okay.
You can do
All
that.
right. That's. I just didn't want to get in a situation where I have multiple procedures having the same steps, and then one changes. You got to change them all.
No, you know, believe me, I've done this for a long time, right? And I've been responsible for budgets, you know, for fleet plans and everything else. And, you know, like I said, it's trying, and I know this sounds very vague and interpretive, but it's trying to find the balance there between that. You know what I mean? You know, I mean, there's the rules where if you branch to something of lesser quality, could that cause a human performance failure? Yes. Well, then you got the answer for you, you know? If it's in good shape, it doesn't follow all the rules like specifically, but it's in good shape, you know, I think you're still safe in doing that also.
Okay.
You know what I mean? But I think it's a little bit of a judgment call on where you're doing that. You also, like I said, you know, we, especially in the nuke industry, we have killed ourselves with bloat.
Yeah.
You know, we have, you know, the corrective action programs. It seems like every time that something's not right, the fixes that added to the procedure. You know what I mean? And so we have notes upon notes upon notes, you know, which then end up with action steps upon action steps buried in notes that you're not allowed to do, you know, or implied action steps. They're not corrective actions and stuff, you know, it's a Band-Aid is really what that is. It's really an error carried forward is where it goes, right? So I think that we just have to be extremely careful with that as you go along.
Okay, thanks.
All right. All right, I'm gonna move on. I'm gonna move on here if I get this thing working here, right? All right, so I know some of you have been in my classes and you've probably heard this and like, oh my God, Steve, you're gonna do this again to me, right? Yes, I am, right? The whole, you know, I had this epiphany about skill to craft when we were helping to develop that definition for EPRI, right? We had the contract to actually do that, right? And when you look at this, when any of us performs tasks, we have these performance modes that we go moving through, right? And so for some of you have not been on my class or our classes, and so this is new, and some of you have, but it's really worth repeating again, right? So what happens is when we as human beings are performing tasks, there's 3 performance modes that we move through. And you can Google this. You can find all kinds of stuff on Google about these performance modes. And there's even videos on this stuff, which I'm not going to show here today. But the point that I'm trying to make is in the 3 performance modes here, I'm going to slip to the next, the 3 performance modes are defined as skill-based, rule-based, and knowledge-based, right? Now, if I go to the next slide, now as depicted on the following slide, each performance mode comes with its own human performance risk, right? As procedure writers, one of our primary responsibilities is to provide steps with the lowest level of human performance risk. So that's the thing for you to do, right? Think about this. You're trying to write a document that provides the greatest margin of safety, the greatest margin to producing an error or from producing an error, right? You're trying to word that, right? To be able to do that. To do that, this is a slide you have to be careful with, right? When we write documents, what we're trying to do them is write them at such a quality level that when the person is performing the procedure that you wrote, you are in skill-based or rule-based as the performance mode as a result of that. So when we write well-written procedures, they're human factored. If you look at the error rate on this, the error rate runs between like 1 in 100 and 1 in 10,000, right? So let me define these real quickly for you. And some of you guys, this is a refresher, right? Skill-based assumes, right, that you're qualified to do the work, that you have a procedure and you've been trained on that procedure. Now, training could have been that someone walked it down with you in the field. You did like on-the-job training, on-the-job evaluation. It doesn't have to be classroom training, right? But someone has kind of walked through the procedure with you. And where there's some weak spots in the procedure, they've helped explain it to you. You understand it. You know, you try to commit the stuff to memory, you know. If you look at that, the error rate is 1 in 1,000 and 1 in 10,000 chance that you're going to screw something up. It's very, very low, right? Then you move into rule-based. And rule-based basically assumes that you're qualified, you have a procedure, but most likely no one's trained you specifically on the content of that procedure. You just have this procedure. It's assumed because you're qualified that overall that you can read it, you're going to understand it, even its weaknesses, and you're going to get it, right? Notice how the risk rate gets a little worse. The rate goes between 1 in 100 to 1 in 1,000. But collectively, between these two things, this is really where you want to be. You want to be between rule-based and skill-based. Where we don't want to be is in knowledge-based. Knowledge-based assumes overall that you may not even have a procedure. You're doing everything from your own knowledge, your own skill to craft, right? Knowledge-based, skill to craft. It has an error rate of 1 in 2 to 1 in 10. That is that's a flip of a coin, basically, right? To 1 in 10. This is a place where maybe you have a procedure, but the procedure has steps in it that say, if required, do this. Slowly open a valve. Things that are vague and interpretive. And you have to use your knowledge and experience to fill gaps, right? To be able to do that, right? So when you look at this, when implementing procedures and work instructions, we want to make sure that workers are either in the skill-based or rule-based areas, okay? Workers should never, notice it says should never, be in knowledge-based performance mode when performing tasks. Knowledge-based mistakes really result from what they call trial and error, right? In these cases, insufficient knowledge about how to perform a task results in the development of a solution that is incorrectly expected to work. And then they have the failure, okay? Now, when you look at this, ultimately, when we're writing procedures, the goal is of what we're trying to accomplish is to manage knowledge-based performance, okay? Now, why bring this up? You can say, Steve, okay, so what are you trying to say? Well, here's some skill of the craft examples. I just went in my library this morning. I was making a couple of tweaks to this little presentation for you. And here's some steps that I just randomly cut out of a varying different, a couple of utilities, refining, But so notice in these steps about what's unique about these. These are skill of the craft examples. Verify plant operation is stable. What does that mean? A certain level, temperature, oscillations, like what is stable, right? Now, yet again, I'm not trying to say to you guys, you walk away from this little seminar thing and now you're like, man, I got to write how for all this. What I'm trying to get you to do is you really got to look at your risk, because overall, a statement like that moves you into this knowledge-based mode of 1 in 2 to 1 in 10. Are you okay with that, right? I mean, if you go back and look at the 6 things of level of detail, right? Consistency, frequency, consequences of the error, and then the other ones that are there, right? If you look at those collectively, maybe it's okay to have that and written that way, because overall they train on this and the consequences are low and all that stuff, but you have to talk your way through it. You just can't cut and paste and put this step in there and say verify plant operation stable. Verify there is sufficient level in the deionized water storage tank. What's sufficient, right? And then they come out and say, oh, by the way, the level indicators are available on the tanks. All right, well, that's great. I'm glad you shared that with me, but it doesn't still tell me what sufficient is. I'm doing that. Am I supposed to know that? Maybe I am, but as a writer, you guys got to ask the question, right? You just can't write a step like this and then just pass it through the review cycle and expect everybody, to sign off on that. Everybody, anybody that reviews a procedure is doing it as a collateral job most of the time anyway, right? And it's always after work hours because they have no time to do stuff. And so, you're always worried that, I've seen procedures like this go all the way through the review cycle, get out in the field, fail almost instantly, and we have to do a revision to it, right? Verify the cooling water return valve to the suction of each deaerator supply pump is open. 3 valves, All right, well, is there a valve number? Are they, is it obvious that these valves are there? That, if they are, then fine. But you know what I mean? Then look at this other one. You're starting something. And before starting the pump, check the direction of the rotation. Also verify the proper bearing lubrication and the stuffing box connections. Does it tell you what type of oil it is? Does it tell you what they're talking about? Be sure the casing and the suction lines are primed. So here you have multiple actions in a paragraph, and it's all written in vague and interpreted, right? Right? Look at this one. Climbing on top of a turbine during the overhaul is a safety concern. A means of safe climbing and standing needs to be established. All right, well, I'm not going to tell you how to do your job. It's just that when you fall off of it and I had to fix the procedure, then we'll go back and we'll put more detail in there on how we expect this thing to be done. You know what I mean? Any waste generated shall be managed according to federal, state, and local regulations, as well as company policy. All waste management activities shall be coordinated through the appropriate environmental contact. That was a safety item that they shoved in the procedure, and it is all shoved to the user to figure out. Right? Now, it always cracks me up because people will have big green banners hanging from the plant that says safety is our #1 priority, right? I found both of these in the same company's procedure, right, to be able to do that. Is safety really their #1 priority? Right? So to develop the right level of detail, taking into consideration the use of skill of the craft, you got to provide a balanced approach. Remember, we're trying to manage knowledge-based performance, which in other words is trying to manage skill of the craft. They're really used interchangeably. They were really one in the same. This means for every step that is written, you have to make a conscientious decision. Do I provide what to do, or do I tell them how to do it? Every single step, you have to answer that question, right? So when you talk about skill of the craft, you take a step back. You can go ahead and cut and paste from something, but then you've got to have this mental discipline that says, okay, did I just tell them what to do, or did I tell them how to do it? Now, if you look at it, there's absolutely nothing that any one of us does that how does not have to come from somewhere, right? So you can provide what to do, which is skill of the craft, but the how has to come from somewhere. Now, the how can come from many places, but in the end, it still has to be present in the knowledge the task performer has in order to complete the task successfully. You just can't have this empty bucket of a person out in the field that's looking for someone to fill them with knowledge, and basically the bucket is empty. There's nothing. You're knocking on the door and there's just no one home. That's where these mistakes are coming from, right? As the work, and then the other thing that you got to remember too, this is really important also, as the workforce changes, what was considered skill and craft at one time may not be sufficient today, and more detail is needed, right? This can be a knowledge-based error trap. Remember, the error rate is 1 in 2 to 1 in 10, right? So I can't tell you how many plants I've been to, like last year before the COVID stuff in there, I was on the road 42 weeks, right? Going over this stuff, either as consultant or teaching classes, whatever else, right? Everywhere I went, it was the same thing I heard. Steve, I just don't get it. We have these procedures. I know they've been used many, many times without a single error. And just last week, we screwed this up. Or they stopped work before they screwed it up, and we had to stop and do an immediate change to the procedure and blah, blah, blah. I just don't understand it. And I'm looking at them, and I'm like, and say, well, how many years have you been here? And he says, well, I've been here for 35 years, right? I said, well, down in the shop, how many years do you think that the person who performed that job, how many years do you think they got? Three. I said, you have over 3 decades of more experience than the person in there, and you wrote what to do. I said, you're part of the problem. I mean, it's not that they're the problem, you're the problem, right? You got to remember, you're not writing it for you. You're writing it for an audience of people, you know, that you have to be able to get this done right, right? So I'm going to pause here for a second. So what this part of the training I was trying to give you is the fact that, you know, when you're looking at this, you got to remember that when you're in knowledge base, you have an error rate of 1 in 2 to 1 in 10. Sometimes you may not perform that job 10 times your entire career. So you got margin. Sometimes you're going to do it more frequently than that. And then next thing you know, you're really getting narrow on where your risk is, right? And so what happens with it is that I don't think people get at times when I talk to them in my rounds of going from plant to plant is that skill of the craft and knowledge-based performance are really one and the same. That means that skill of the craft has a potential error rate of 1 in 2 to 1 in 10. That's why when you go back and look what EPRI did when they wrote the definition, they said, look, you got to be able to perform this consistently error-free, and that's why they added independent of the risk to human performance. That's why they threw that little buzzword in there. Also, notice they said, hey, it's going to be independent of written instructions to be able to do that. So when you think about skill of the craft and you're trying to figure out, well, can I write what to do or I need to write how? You can write what to do. I'm not trying to tell you not to do that, right? It's just that every time that you put one of these statements in there that says, like this one did over here, where it says, verify that there's sufficient level in this water tank. How do they know? Are they trained on that? Is it part of their basic operator qualifications? If you feel that that's knowledgeable, maybe the level indicator on the side of the tank has a high and a low on it, and it's like painted right there, you know? All right, well then you're okay. You're all right with that. But sometimes that means you have to get out of your cube and walk out in the field and check this thing out. You just can't do it from where you're sitting in your seat, you know, to be able to do it. Now today is particularly hard because almost all my staff is working from home. You know, we don't have that, you know, where you can ask that question. We got to ask someone in the plant that's there running it to go out there in the field, right? Any questions before I get into the conclusion piece?
No, we're all good.
All good? Okay. So, in conclusion, skill of craft is knowledge-based performance. It comes with an error rate of 1 to 2 to 1 in 10, right? Every action step consists of 3 parts: the who, the what, and the how. You have to remember how has to come from somewhere. Do not fall in the trap of making an error carried forward by cutting and pasting. Don't do that, right? Remember, skill of craft is defined as the skills that someone has. They're qualified to do their job by some qualification process, right? They got to be able to do it consistently error-free, independent of human performance risk, right? And it doesn't rely on written instructions or procedures, right? Now, you got to remember to emphasize, perform consistently error-free and independent of a human performance risk. It's big, right? You've got to remember to use the other 5 levels of detail. See, there's 6 total, which includes skill of the craft, but the other 5 helps you in helping make this determination. Like, okay, what about their experience and qualifications? What about the complexity of what they're doing? This is a simple task. All right, I'm going to write what to do. The frequency, they do it all the time. I'm not really worried about complacency. It's not performed that frequently. So I think in this side, frequency is good. It's going to help them, right? Consistency. All right, well, we want everybody to do it the same way. You know, Tracy does a little bit different than I do. She's a smart lady and she'll get it. She always does it right. You know, I'm just going to tell them what, you know, what about the consequences of the error? What if they do it wrong? Maybe it's going to go boom, you know, boom's not good. You know, it's just not good, right? So in conclusion, That's the things I wanted to share with you. In the class, when we teach the PPA class, we go over all these things. But, I usually have like an hour to talk about all 6 of these things. And so, I get like 3 minutes, maybe kind of 5 minutes or something, just to talk about skilled craft. We don't go into it in a lot of detail. And I think sometimes it's just a disadvantage to you all, right? I mean, I think that, we kind of talk about the 18 things that are human performance errors, we kind of talk about the fact that you have, the level of detail and the things you got to consider in there. But, we get into that skilled craft thing. We talk about the performance modes, but sometimes it doesn't tie it all together, So I thought, hey, for this little luncheon thing, and now that I'm extremely hungry, I thought maybe we'd throw it all together. Well, thank you guys all for participating with this. We really appreciate that and sharing it with your friends and whatever else as we continue to take this little tiny woman-owned business and continue to try to grow it and spread the safety to everybody. Environmental health and safety is paramount, especially today as the workforce is changing out. And we truly committed to writing the highest quality procedures that exist out there. And if we can be part of it and help you, or if you have questions like that, always feel free to drop me an email or phone call. I'm always there for you guys, so don't be afraid. I learned a lot from your questions, so it's a self-winning prophecy for me. I can't go wrong with it. So if I can share what I know, I will point you in the right direction to where to go. I'll be glad to help you out, so don't be afraid to ask. And have a good day.